It was the winter of 1944, and in the rolling plains of central Texas, the air carried little trace of the season that Germans once called Weihnachten. The camp near Hearne stood quiet beneath a pale sky, its wooden barracks aligned with military precision, encircled by tall fences and rows of barbed wire that glittered in the sunlight. Inside those fences lived more than 4,000 German prisoners of war, soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had once marched across Europe in the name of a cause now collapsing. They had come from Africa, from Italy, from the ruins of France, crossing the ocean in crowded transport ships, and now found themselves surrounded not by battlefields, but by cotton fields. The land was foreign, the language unfamiliar, and the silence heavy. For many of the prisoners, this would be the first Christmas spent far from home, without snow, without the sound of church bells, without family. The war had stripped them of identity and rank. Here they were no longer officers or enlisted men, only numbers stitched to khaki uniforms. Evenings passed in routine, roll calls, rations, letters that came rarely, and work assignments under the Texas sun. The barracks smelled of dust, soap, and fatigue. Each man carried his memories like contraband, hidden, fragile, and dangerous to reveal. As December advanced, the prisoners began to sense the season in small, almost secret ways. Some remembered the smell of pine and candles. Others hummed fragments of carols under their breath while mending clothes or repairing tools. The guards noticed, but said nothing. The Americans who ran Camp Hearne were strict, but not cruel. They enforced rules, yet they allowed what they called morale activities, handicrafts, music, even religion, believing that structure and dignity prevented despair. Among the prisoners were carpenters, metalworkers, engineers, and artists, men who once built bridges or repaired machinery for the Wehrmacht. Now they used the same skills to carve chess pieces, repair furniture, and make small gifts out of tin cans and wire. As Christmas approached, a few men in the camp hospital decided to build something symbolic, something that would remind them that the world still held beauty. There were no trees to cut in the barren Texas soil, no evergreen branches to decorate, no ornaments left from home. But in the workshop behind the barracks, they began gathering scraps, bent nails, wire, fragments of tin, bits of green paper, discarded packaging from the American mess hall. Slowly, with patient hands, they shaped these remnants into the outline of a Christmas tree. It was fragile, uneven, and a little absurd. Standing there in the corner of the ward, its branches glinting faintly under a single bulb. When the American guard saw it, they did not take it down. Instead, one of them brought a length of wire to steady the base, and another found a spare lamp cord so that the prisoners could make a small light at the top. The act required no words and no permission from higher command. It was simply allowed to exist, a fragile gesture of humanity inside a world built on obedience and control. That night, as the sky turned copper over the Texas plains, the barracks glowed faintly from within. For the first time in months, men who had crossed continents to fight found themselves united not by ideology or uniform, but by the faint shimmer of memory. In that handmade tree, they saw more than metal and wire. They saw proof that even in captivity, the instinct to create, to remember, and a hope could not be confined by fences or flags. This small moment, lost among thousands of others in the machinery of war, marked something profound. It showed that the war, despite all its destruction, had not entirely silenced a part of man that longed for peace. The Hearne Christmas tree stood not as a decoration, but as a quiet rebellion against despair, a fragile reminder that even enemies could share the same light. For the German prisoners held in Texas, the small gesture of being allowed to celebrate Christmas was something that defied everything they had come to expect from war. Many of them had surrendered in North Africa or Europe after years of propaganda that portrayed the enemy as ruthless and unforgiving. They had been told that capture by the Americans would mean humiliation, starvation, or death. Yet, upon arriving in the camps, they found a world that contradicted that fear. The fences were real, the discipline was strict, and the hierarchy was rigid, but behind it there was a kind of order that carried traces of civility. Prisoners were fed regularly, received medical treatment, and were even paid small wages for their labor. Still, suspicion remained. To most of them, the Americans were not people but the faceless enemy who had bombed their cities and driven them from a battlefield. Inside the camp, the emotional landscape was complicated. Some men still clung to their military pride. Others hid their shame. The war had stripped them of direction, and captivity had replaced duty with emptiness. Life was reduced to routine, roll call, work detail, meals, sleep, and each day resembled the last. Letters from home arrived rarely, and when they did, they carried news of destruction, hunger, and loss. Christmas, for men like these, was not a holiday but a reminder of absence. It was a season of everything they no longer possessed: family, warmth, faith, and identity. The prisoners' greatest fear was invisibility, the idea that they would live and die behind the wire, forgotten by both sides. Many of them viewed the American guards as mechanical extensions of the war machine, not as individuals. When the first signs of leniency appeared, a chance to attend religious service, to sing quietly in the evenings, or to craft decorations from scrap, it unsettled them. They did not know how to interpret kindness from the enemy. In their world, built on ideology and obedience, compassion had been described as weakness. To see it now, from those who had defeated them, forced them to question not only their captors, but themselves. The camp administration's decision to allow small cultural expressions, including Christmas observances, was not an accident. The War Department had instructed that prisoners should be treated according to the Geneva Convention, partly to set an example for how captured Americans should be treated in Europe. But for the men behind the fence, this policy felt like a moral paradox. How could the enemy who had destroyed their homeland allow them to celebrate? The contradiction tore at the foundations of everything they had been taught. It blurred the line between victor and vanquished, right and wrong, us and them. When the Christmas preparations began, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. Some prisoners refused to participate, suspicious that it was a form of control or propaganda. Others, desperate for meaning, threw themselves into it with quiet intensity. They collected tin scraps, folded paper ornaments, and painted makeshift stars with ink diluted from fountain pens. What began as a simple act of remembrance soon became an emotional reckoning. The permission to build a tree, to light a small lamp, to sing a carol without punishment. It all carried a weight that none of them had expected. The guards watched but did not interfere. Their silence was its own message. For the prisoners, this was the moment when the world they had known fractured completely. The war had been built on hatred, on the idea that humanity could be divided into nations and races, into those deserving of mercy and those beyond it. Yet here, in a barren Texas camp, the enemy had extended a gesture of dignity. It was not grand or heroic. It was simple, human, and therefore more powerful. For the first time, many of the Germans began to see their captors as people rather than symbols. That realization was as disorienting as the defeat itself. It stripped the war of its moral armor and left them exposed to an unfamiliar truth. That compassion could come from those they had been taught to despise. The Christmas tree they built was more than decoration. It was a proof that even in the machinery of captivity, humanity could still survive. And that understanding, quiet and painful, marked the true beginning of their transformation. During the Second World War, the United States became the unexpected custodian of one of the largest populations of Axis prisoners of war in history. Between 1942 and 1946, more than 400,000 German soldiers were transported across the Atlantic, along with smaller numbers of Italians and Japanese, to nearly 500 POW camps scattered across the American mainland. The majority of these camps were concentrated in the rural South and Midwest, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Iowa, and Georgia, where land was inexpensive, labor was needed, and isolation was easily maintained. Texas alone held over 70,000 German prisoners in dozens of major and branch camps, including Camp Hearne, Camp Huntsville, and Camp Mahia. The movement of prisoners was a vast logistical operation that reflected the global scale of the war. German captives came mostly from North African Europe after the Allied victories of 1943. Thousands of men from Rommel's Afrika Korps, captured in Tunisia, were shipped first to Britain and then to ports such as New Orleans, Boston, and Norfolk before being dispersed inland by train. When they arrived, they were shocked not by brutality but by the unexpected normalcy of their surroundings. Most American camps were built quickly but efficiently. Long wooden barracks, mess halls, workshops, infirmaries, chapels, and recreation areas. The camps were designed to operate as self-contained communities under the supervision of the U.S. Army Service Forces. From the start, the American government made a calculated decision to follow the rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention. It was both a moral and a strategic policy. Officials believed that treating German prisoners humanely would protect American POWs held in Europe and demonstrate to the world that democracy could remain civilized even in total war. Each camp provided adequate food, medical care, and housing comparable to that of American soldiers. Prisoners were issued uniforms marked with PW, received pay for their labor, and were permitted to correspond to their families through censored but regular mail. Inspections by the International Red Cross confirmed that most camps met the required standards. Camp Hearne, located near the small town of Hearne, Texas, became one of the most well-known. Established in 1943, it housed more than 4,000 German soldiers, many of them veterans of North Africa and Italy. It earned the nickname the Fritz Ritz because of its relative comfort and the discipline of its inmates. The camp included theaters, a library, classrooms, and workshops where prisoners could pursue trades or academic courses. Religious services were common, and ministers or chaplains among the prisoners were allowed to conduct worship. Music, painting, and handicraft were encouraged as morale-building activities. These policies reflected a broader American philosophy that productive, occupied prisoners were less likely to cause trouble. Despite this structure, cultural and emotional tensions remained. Some of the German prisoners still believed in the Nazi cause and tried to enforce ideological control over others. Secret disciplinary groups operated in several camps, punishing those suspected of cooperation or dissent. Yet over time, especially in the southern camps, the rigidity of wartime ideology began to erode. Local farmers who worked alongside prisoners in cotton fields or sawmills saw them not as monsters, but as young men caught in circumstances larger than themselves. Many communities eventually accepted their presence with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. The environment itself played a role in reshaping the prisoners' perception of captivity. Texas winters were mild, the sky enormous, the rhythm of life slow and repetitive. For men who had survived the chaos of Africa or the ruins of Europe, the American landscape felt strangely peaceful. There were no air raids, no front lines, no sirens at night. The most striking difference, however, was the way the guards treated them. The American soldiers who managed the camps were often reservists or men unfit for overseas combat, and they carried out their duties with professionalism but without hatred. They maintained control through structure, not violence. As the months passed, the camps developed their own fragile order. Prisoners worked in agriculture and construction, producing labor that replaced American workers sent to war. They organized orchestras, published handwritten newspapers, and even stage plays, sometimes Shakespeare, sometimes German folk dramas. These activities were not propaganda. They were survival. For many, life in captivity became the first exposure to a society that functioned without fear or coercion. By the end of 1944, when the war in Europe neared its final phase, the German prisoners in America had begun to form a more complex view of their captors. They realized that the treatment they received was not weakness, but confidence, the strength of a nation that could afford compassion. Camp Hearne reflected this paradox most clearly. Within its fences, men who had once fought under Hitler found themselves carving wooden toys for local children, painting landscapes of the Texas plains, and celebrating Christmas under the supervision of the very army they had once tried to defeat. The Geneva Convention had ensured their safety, but American humanity had given them something rarer, the chance to rediscover their own. As December 1944 approached, the war in Europe was entering its final, brutal chapter, but in the quiet fields of Texas, time seemed suspended. At Camp Hearne, the routine of captivity continued as it had for months. Roll calls, work details, meals, and long evenings spent behind the wire. For the German prisoners, each day was a reminder that they were far from home, trapped between defeat and uncertainty. Rumors of Allied advances and bombings reached them through censored letters. Yet the rhythm of camp life remained strangely detached from the chaos of the outside world. It was in this uneasy calm that the thought of Christmas returned, a fragile memory of warmth and belonging that refused to die. There were no evergreen trees to cut, No snow to mark the season, and no candles to light. The flat Texas plains offered nothing resembling the Christmases the men had once known. Yet within the camp's hospital ward, where some of the sick and injured prisoners spent their days, a small group decided to recreate the holiday in whatever form they could manage. It began quietly, almost in secret. They did not expect permission, nor did they seek attention. They gathered what little they had: wire left over from repairs, pieces of tin from food cans, bits of cardboard packaging from Red Cross parcels, and green paper saved from ration boxes. The plan was simple: to build something that resembled a Christmas tree, even if only in outline. The effort was clumsy but deliberate. They bent the wire into a cone shape, cutting and twisting until it stood upright on its own. Tin scraps were flattened and cut into stars, which they tied to the branches with string pulled from the seams of their clothing. From cardboard they shaped small ornaments, painting them with soot mixed with toothpaste to create a dull silver sheen. A few of the men scavenged colored foil from cigarette wrappers sent in care packages, folding it carefully into garlands. Every detail mattered. Every piece was a fragment of memory. In the late afternoon, one of the guards noticed the men at work. He did not intervene. The American command had long understood that allowing small gestures of culture and faith could help maintain order. The Geneva Convention guaranteed prisoners the right to religious practice, and within those limits, the men of Camp Hearne had previously held modest services. But this was different. The Christmas tree was not only a symbol of religion, it was a symbol of identity, of home, and of peace, concepts the war had tried to erase. The guard watched them for a while, then left without a word. Later that evening, a senior American officer entered the ward to inspect the space. The prisoners froze, expecting reprimand. Instead, the officer examined their work, a crooked frame of wire decorated with tin stars and paper chains, and simply nodded. There were no orders to dismantle it. He told one of the guards to find a piece of wire that could support a small bulb at the top and allowed them to connect it to an electrical outlet. The single light glowed faintly over the makeshift branches, casting long shadows on the walls of the barracks. That act, though small, carried enormous meaning. For the prisoners, it was permission to remember that they were still human beings capable of beauty and faith. For the Americans, it was an acknowledgement that victory did not require humiliation. The gesture was not sentimental, was pragmatic, even quiet, but revealed the deeper moral logic of the camp system in the United States. By allowing such expressions, the command prevented despair and rebellion, while preserving discipline through respect. As night fell, word of the tree spread through camp. Some of the healthier prisoners came to see it through the windows of the infirmary. Others offered scraps of material to add to it: buttons, bits of colored thread, even ration wrappers folded into little shapes. Soon, the tree stood not only as an ornament, but as a collective creation. Every man who contributed left a piece of his story there. In the simplicity of that act lay the essence of the catalyst. The Christmas tree, built from debris and lit by a single bulb, became a quiet rebellion against the emotional emptiness of captivity. It transformed the space of confinement into a space of memory. It reminded the men that dignity could survive even in submission, that kindness could exist even between enemies, and that war could not extinguish the human desire to create symbols of hope. Historically, such moments were not unique to Camp Hearne. Across the United States, similar acts occurred in German POW camps, where prisoners were allowed to celebrate Christmas with improvised decorations and small services. At Camp Algona in Iowa, fellow Germans even built a full nativity scene from plaster and wood, which became a local legend. These gestures, sanctioned quietly by American officers, reflected a broader cultural understanding. To win the war was one thing, but to preserve humanity while doing so was another. In that December of 1944, the men at Hearne unknowingly became part of that tradition, one small light in the vast shadow of war. The work on the Christmas tree soon turned from a small act of nostalgia into a collective mission that united the camp in quiet purpose. What had begun as a few men in the hospital ward bending pieces of wire became a shared effort that spread through several barracks. The prisoners of Camp Hearne, most of them skilled tradesmen, artisans, and engineers by training, instinctively organized themselves the way they once had on construction sites or factory floors. Without orders or hierarchy, they created a system. Some gathered materials from the workshops and maintenance sheds, discarded tin from food containers, nails, bits of copper wire, and wooden scraps from repair projects. Others scoured the campgrounds for anything that could serve as decoration. Within days, the tree had taken shape. The base was made from a wooden crate reinforced with metal rod, and the branches were lengths of wire bent into uneven tiers. It was not beautiful in the traditional sense, but it carried the unmistakable silhouette of a Christmas tree. The men who worked on it were meticulous, almost reverent. They sanded the edges of the tin stars to keep them from cutting hands, tied ornaments with string made from unraveled socks, and layered cardboard cutouts into geometric shapes that caught the dim light of the ward. Those who had access to paints or dyes from the art classes mixed them with toothpaste and ash to create dull shades of green and silver. The hospital staff quietly contributed as well. One of the German medics brought old bandages that were no longer usable. Soaked in a weak mixture of green ink, they were wrapped around the metal branches, softening the harshness of the wire and giving the illusion of foliage. Another prisoner, who had once been a theater stage designer in Hamburg, crafted a small star from a flattened food tin and attached it to the top with wire. When he stepped back, the object shone faintly under the overhead light. Not with brilliance, but with sincerity. The process of creation became its own form of ritual. Each evening, after roll call, the men returned to the ward, bringing small offerings. Someone found a piece of red cloth from a torn handkerchief. Another donated the silver foil from a cigarette pack. These bits of color broke the monotony of khaki and gray that defined their world. As they worked, the camp grew quieter. The tension that usually filled the barracks, the rivalry between ranks, the boredom, the unspoken guilt, seemed to fade. In its place came a rare stillness, a sense of cooperation that no officer had ordered but everyone obeyed. For the prisoners, the act of making something beautiful carried a significance far beyond the object itself. They had spent years destroying cities, bridges, lives, and now, in captivity, they were building again. The tree, assembled from the discarded remains of military supply chains, became an inversion of war's logic. It was fragile, unnecessary, and utterly human. In its creation, they rediscovered the gestures of peace, patience, precision, and care. The American guards observed this transformation with quiet interest. They had seen prisoners construct model ships, sculptures, even small gardens inside the wire, but the Christmas tree had a different energy. It was personal, emotional, and deeply cultural. It represented the part of the enemy that had nothing to do with uniforms or ideology. To allow it was a risk. Large gatherings could cause unrest, but it was also a test of discipline through trust. When the officers decided not to interfere, it gave the prisoners a measure of agency they had not felt since capture. As the structure neared completion, the men began to prepare the surroundings. They cleaned the ward, scrubbed the floor, and placed benches along the walls. Someone hung a small hand-painted sign that read, simply, Heilige Nacht. They did not have candles, so they placed reflective tin discs at the base of the tree to catch the electric light and shimmer faintly. When evening fell and the single bulb above the star flickered to life, the effect was modest yet profound. The cold interior of the ward seemed warmer, the walls less confining. The act of collective creation was, for many, the first meaningful experience they had since capture. It offered a reminder of rhythm, of collaboration, and of the shared language of craft that transcended politics. It also became a form of quiet defiance, not against their captors, but against despair itself. In the small, glowing tree they had built from waste and imagination, the prisoners found proof that even in the most regulated and dehumanized environment, the will to create remained an expression of freedom. The sound of their tools, the soft murmur of German hymns, and the glint of tin ornaments stitched together a fragile moment of peace inside a war that had long since lost its mercy. For the American soldiers stationed at Camp Hearne, Christmas of 1944 was unlike any other night of the war. Most of the guard were young men from the southern United States, many of them farmers, teachers, or mechanics before they had been drafted. Few had seen combat. Their assignment to guard prisoners of war on home soil was considered uneventful duty. Yet even within that routine, discipline was strict. The soldiers understood that their authority depended on consistency. A lapse in control could lead to unrest, and the camp command emphasized order above all else. But on that December night, when the sounds of Stille Nacht drifted from the hospital ward, the atmosphere within the fences changed. The guards had grown used to the noises of the camp. Boots on gravel, roll calls in German, the metallic clang of the mess hall. But this was different. The singing came softly at first, a few voices in harmony, rising from the infirmary where the makeshift Christmas tree stood. The melody carried across the compound, clear enough to reach the sentry towers and the barracks beyond. Many of the Americans recognized the tune. It was the same carol they had sung as children in their own churches and schools, only now in a different language. The familiarity of it disarmed them. For a few minutes, the line between guard and prisoner seemed to blur. One of the guards later wrote in a letter home that it was the first time he had truly felt the weight of the war's contradiction. He described standing by the fence, rifle in hand, listening to men who only months before had fought for a regime that demanded total hatred, now singing of peace on earth. The sound was not triumphant or mournful. It was humble, human, and deeply unsettling. The soldiers did not receive orders to silence it, and none were needed. They stood quietly, letting the song drift into the warm Texas night. Historically, moments like this were not unique to Camp Hearne. Reports from other prisoner of war camps across the United States described similar experiences during Christmas and Easter, when the strict rhythm of captivity briefly gave way to reflection. The War Department, following the Geneva Convention, permitted religious observances and encouraged humane treatment, believing it maintained morale on both sides. But the emotional reality of those policies was often felt most strongly by the guards themselves. Many had entered service believing in clear moral boundaries. The enemy was evil, America was righteous. Yet witnessing the prisoners' humanity challenged that simplicity. For some soldiers, the experience reshaped their understanding of duty. Guarding the prisoners was not an act of vengeance, but of stewardship. They had to embody the values they claimed to fight for: justice, restraint, and dignity, even toward those who had been taught to despise them. In interviews conducted after the war, veterans who had served as guard at camps in Texas, Arkansas, and Kansas often spoke of how these assignments changed their perception of Germans. They came to see them as ordinary men, capable of kindness, humor, and remorse. At Camp Hearne, the night of the Christmas celebration became a quiet test of faith in the American system itself. The officers had chosen not to interfere, trusting that discipline could coexist with compassion. When the carol ended, there was no applause, no orders shouted, no confrontation. The guards returned to their posts, and the prisoners to their bunks. Yet something intangible had shifted. In the days that followed, the men of the guard detail noticed a change in the camp's rhythm. The prisoners were calmer, more cooperative. Conversations between sentries and prisoners became less formal, more like exchanges between workers and supervisors than between enemies. The officers recorded no breaches of discipline, no escape attempts, no violence. The simple permission to sing, to build a tree, to mark a holiday, had reaffirmed a fragile trust that discipline alone could not sustain. For many of the American guards, the memory of that night outlasted the war itself. In their recollections, it was not a moment of sentimentality, but a revelation, a realization that victory meant more than defeating an enemy on the battlefield. It meant proving that ideals could survive power. Standing in the dim light, surrounded by fences, the guards understood that the real challenge of war was not destroying what one hates, but protecting what one believes in. When historians later examined the records of Camp Hearne and similar POW sites, they found little written about this particular Christmas night. No official report, no formal acknowledgement. But in the private letters, diaries, and oral histories of men who had served there, the memory persisted. It remained as evidence that even the most structured and hierarchical systems, small moments of mercy could redefine what it meant to serve. The guards had not abandoned discipline. They had simply allowed humanity to breathe within it. And in that delicate balance, they had discovered a kind of victory that no weapon could deliver. The Christmas night at Camp Hearne did not remain an isolated episode. Across the United States, similar scenes unfolded in hundreds of prisoner of war camps where German soldiers experienced, often for the first time, a version of captivity that allowed dignity instead of degradation. The American government's decision to adhere to the Geneva Convention created conditions in which cultural expression and faith could coexist with military discipline. What began as an administrative policy evolved into a quiet experiment in rehumanization. The celebration at Hearne, small and local, mirrored a pattern repeated across the country, moments when the rigid machinery of war gave way to glimpses of shared humanity. In many camps, the Christmas season became a test of the balance between security and compassion. Commanders were instructed to permit limited religious services, music, and decorations, as long as they did not interfere with order. Within those rules, creativity flourished. At Camp Algona in Iowa, German prisoners constructed one of the most remarkable works of art to emerge from captivity, a full-scale nativity scene made of plaster, wood, and paint. Built in 1944 under the guidance of 6 skilled craftsmen, men who had been artists and builders in civilian life. The scene included more than 60 hand-carved figures, each rendered with extraordinary care. When the war ended, the townspeople preserved it, and decades later became the centerpiece of the Algona Nativity Scene Museum. It stood as enduring proof that beauty could be born even in the midst of confinement. Other camps had similar stories, though on smaller scales. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma and Camp Mahia in Texas, prisoners organized Christmas concerts using makeshift instruments and performed choral pieces for both fellow prisoners and guards. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, German artisans built wooden toys for local American children as gifts from the prisoners. At Camp Stark in New Hampshire, where conditions were harsher due to the northern winter, men used cardboard and tin foil to decorate their barracks, creating stars and wreaths that reminded them of home. In each place, the initiative came from the prisoners themselves, but it was the tolerance of the guards that made these moments possible. American newspapers occasionally covered these stories, often in short articles buried within local sections. Reports described the remarkable discipline and good spirit of the German prisoners who celebrated Christmas peacefully under supervision. To readers weary of years of bloodshed, these stories carried symbolic meaning. They suggested that the United States, even while waging a total war, had not surrendered its moral compass. War correspondents and chaplains who visited the camps often wrote that the humane treatment of prisoners served as a quiet form of psychological warfare, an assertion that democratic societies could conquer hatred not only with strength but with restraint. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which conducted regular inspections of American POW camps, noted in its 1944 and 1945 reports that morale among German prisoners improved significantly when cultural and religious activities were permitted. Inspectors found that camps allowing music, art, and worship recorded fewer disciplinary problems, fewer suicide attempts, and higher rates of cooperation. At Hearne and Algona alike, Red Cross observers reported that prisoners who engaged in creative or religious practices displayed a greater sense of self-respect and order. These findings confirmed what many camp officers had already observed, that recognizing a prisoner's humanity did not weaken control, it reinforced it. The influence extended beyond the fences. Local civilians who interacted with the prisoners, particularly in rural areas where POWs worked on farms, often witnessed their cultural activities firsthand. Some were invited to see the Christmas displays or listen to music performed by the camp orchestras. Many were struck by the contrast between the wartime propaganda that had demonized the Germans and the ordinary, polite young men they met in person. For small American towns, the POW camps became unlikely spaces of cross-cultural contact, fleeting glimpses of reconciliation before peace was officially restored. When the war ended in 1945 and the repatriation of prisoners began, stories of those Christmas celebrations lingered in memory. American officers spoke of them in post-war interviews as moments that had restored their own belief in the principles for which they fought. Some former prisoners, writing years later from Germany, recalled the holidays in captivity not with bitterness but with gratitude. For them, the permission to build a tree, carve a nativity scene, or sing familiar songs had symbolized the first fracture in the wall of ideology that had isolated them from the rest of the world. In historical hindsight, these small acts of humanity formed an invisible network of influence that reached far beyond the camps. They demonstrated that mercy could function as a form of power, that compassion could reinforce order, and that moral strength could coexist with military victory. The echoes of those nights, of Stille Nacht sung under American Guard, of wooden figures carved by prisoners far from home, remained as enduring evidence that civilization, even in wartime, depended not only on conquest, but on the willingness to let others remember who they were. When the war ended in 1945, the German prisoners who had spent months or years behind American fences were gradually repatriated to a devastated homeland. For many of them, the return was more disorienting than captivity had been. They stepped off transport ships into cities reduced to rubble, into societies struggling to reckon with defeat and moral collapse. Yet among those who had been held in the United States, a quiet transformation had taken place. The experiences they carried back were not only of loss and humiliation, but of something rarer, encounters with civility, fairness, and compassion that stood in stark contrast to the ideology under which they had once fought. Historians later noted that the American system of prisoner management had an unintentional yet profound influence on post-war German reconstruction. In contrast to the camps in the Soviet Union, where survival often depended on brutality, the U.S. camps had become small laboratories of democracy. Within their boundaries, prisoners elected spokesmen, managed work assignments, ran schools, and published newspapers. These habits of organization, encouraged by American officers, taught men who had been raised under dictatorship how to operate within systems that valued discussion and self-governance. When they returned to Germany, many former prisoners drew on those lessons as they rebuilt their communities and industries. In interviews and memoirs published in the 1950s and 1960s, countless ex-prisoners described their time in America as a moral turning point. They wrote that they had arrived with fear and resentment, but left with a new understanding of freedom, not as a political slogan, but as a lived condition grounded in respect, order, and responsibility. For some, that revelation began with small gestures, such as being allowed to celebrate Christmas, attend church, or speak openly to their captors. They realized that freedom did not mean the absence of rules. It meant the presence of fairness. A number of those men chose to return to the United States years later as immigrants. Former German POWs who had worked on farms during their captivity often received invitations from American families to come back after the war as free laborers or craftsmen. Some became engineers, carpenters, or artists. Others pursued education through programs like the GI Bill's international partnerships. They carried with them an enduring respect for the country that had once imprisoned them, seeing in it not perfection, but a model of humanity that had survived war. Among those who transformed memory into art was a sculptor named Joseph Braun from Hanover, who had been a prisoner in Texas. In the late 1950s, he created a work titled Tree of Peace, inspired by the Christmas tree he and his comrades had built from wire and tin in the Hearne Camp Hospital. The sculpture, now displayed in a small museum in Lower Saxony, became a local symbol of reconciliation. Braun described the piece as a tree that grew not from soil, but from mercy. Its twisted branches of bronze mirrored the fragility and endurance of hope that had defined that moment of captivity. The legacy of those experiences extended beyond individual lives. Across Germany, returning prisoners spoke of the fairness of American guards and the sense of stability that had governed the camps. Their stories challenged stereotypes of the enemy and subtly influenced public attitudes toward democracy and the Allied occupation. American administrators who oversaw the repatriation process observed that POWs who had been held in the United States were often more cooperative, pragmatic, and open to post-war reforms than those who had experienced harsher captivity elsewhere. In the early years of the Federal Republic of Germany, a number of former POWs became teachers, engineers, or local officials who emphasized ethics of responsibility over ideology. Even decades later, the memory of those wartime Christmases in captivity remained vivid. Veterans associations in both Germany and the United States held small commemorations honoring the humane conduct shown in the POW camps. The Algona nativity scene was preserved and became a pilgrimage site for families and historians, visited each year during the holidays. Former guards and prisoners occasionally met again, exchanging letters and photographs. Their former enmity transformed into quiet friendship. The symbolic power of that transformation endured because it had not been orchestrated by propaganda or policy, but by ordinary human decency. The handmade tree at Hearne, like the nativity scene in Algona, had demonstrated that compassion could outlast violence. In those moments of fragile peace, The prisoners glimpsed a world that might exist after the war, a world where freedom meant not dominance but empathy. For many of them, that understanding proved stronger than any ideology they had once believed in, and for the Americans who permitted it, the memory served as proof that true victory was measured not by the defeat of an army, but by the survival of conscience. The story of the Christmas tree at Camp Hearne stood as a quiet reminder that peace did not begin with treaties or signatures, but with individual choices made in silence. The war had been fought on an industrial scale, driven by ideologies that reduce humanity to categories: enemy and ally, conqueror and captive, right and wrong. Yet, within the narrow boundaries of a Texas prisoner of war camp, that order briefly inverted. The small act of allowing German prisoners to build a tree out of scrap metal and paper, to sing their carols and light a single bulb, represented something far greater than the event itself. It was the assertion that mercy, when extended even to one's enemies, possessed a moral strength that no army could enforce and no doctrine could replace. In a world exhausted by destruction, the Christmas night of 1944 revealed how fragile and yet how resilient human decency could be. The men on both sides of the fence had been trained to believe that compassion undermined discipline, that mercy endangered victory. But the reality of that evening suggested the opposite. By allowing empathy to coexist with authority, the guards did not weaken their command, they deepened it. Discipline built on fear was temporary. Discipline built on respect endured. That insight, though rarely spoken aloud, became one of the most enduring lessons of the prisoner experience in America. For the prisoners, the handmade tree symbolized the first small victory over despair. They had entered captivity stripped of identity, reduced in numbers and uniforms. But through the simple act of creation, they reclaimed their humanity. The tree stood as proof that even in confinement, people could shape meaning from fragments, beauty from ruin. For the Americans who watched, it was a mirror, a reminder that the ideals of liberty and fairness for which they fought were not abstractions, but living responsibilities. The ability to treat the defeated with dignity was not a gesture of charity. It was a test of national conscience. Historically, this ethos reflected a broader shift in the understanding of victory itself. The Second World War had begun as a conflict of annihilation, yet as it drew to its close, the victors were forced to confront the moral cost of total war. In the United States, the humane treatment of prisoners became part of the country's moral narrative, a demonstration that democracy could defend itself without surrendering to cruelty. The tree at Hearne, small and almost forgotten, embodied that paradox. It showed that civilization was not measured by technology or conquest, but by the capacity to choose empathy in moments when hatred seemed most justified. The event also illuminated a deeper truth about the nature of peace. Peace was not merely the cessation of violence. It was the reawakening of recognition, the ability to see the enemy as human once more. In that sense, the Christmas tree was both a religious and a philosophical act. It reunited men across the boundaries of war through memory and ritual, proving that shared traditions could survive even the fractures of ideology. The same song, Stille Nacht, that had once drifted over the trenches of World War I now echoed faintly across an American camp yard, bridging decades of conflict and division. The legacy of that night extended beyond those who witnessed it. For decades afterward, the men who had stood guard or sung beside the tree carried its image as a counterpoint to the larger narrative of destruction. In their memories, it marked not a grand event but a pause in history, a moment when the machinery of war briefly yielded to something older and more enduring than power. The instinct to protect, to forgive, to connect. It was in such moments, scattered and quiet, that the moral foundations of post-war reconciliation were laid. The Christmas tree of Hearne, built from wire, tin, and thread, belonged to no nation. It stood as a symbol of what remains when ideology collapses and only conscience endures. Against the vast scale of violence, it seemed insignificant, a fragile shape lit by a single bulb in a world of explosions. Yet, in its simplicity lay the essence of recovery. Peace, it suggested, was not a condition granted by victors, but a discipline learned through empathy. The war ended months later in Europe, but in that small corner of Texas, for a few hours on Christmas night, the future had already begun.